Hello, this video is going to take you through the last 50 or so lines of the play Hamlet, really from the moment when Fortinbras enters the stage. So, looking at line 352 onwards, we've had such a claustrophobic, insular focus of the court of Elsinore throughout the entire play. Aside from, for example, things like the graveyard scene, and even then we are very near the court of Elsinore, we never actually witness anything that isn't within the court itself or closely associated with it. And finally, at the end, we have two groups of outsiders who enter. The ambassadors from England representing the King of England and Fortinbras. And Fortinbras, of course, has beaten the Polacks, as they're called in the play. He has succeeded in his aim of gaining that, little piece of ground, that eggshell that Hamlet spoke about in his soliloquy in Act 4, Scene 4. So Fortinbras enters the stage as a prince who has fulfilled his quest, and very much still the epitome of the heroic warrior, the man of action. So let's have a look at when Fortinbras enters. Fortinbras is appalled. Where is this sight? He means, what is happening? What has happened here? It's worth stating that Fortinbras is not somebody who's unused to death or unused to suffering. He has, of course, just come from a war. And we have a marked distinction between, death on the battlefield and death as a result of murder, and death, if you like, in the exterior and death in the interior. So this prince, who's presented as being quite bloodthirsty within the play, is genuinely appalled at what he sees before him. Horatio, of course, his dramatic function at the end here is to bear witness to Hamlet's story. He is no longer Hamlet's confidant. Now Hamlet's passed away, but he's heard Hamlet's dying wish, which is that he is going to be the voice for the prince and to spare his wounded name. And Horatio addresses the prince bitterly and confidently. What is it ye would see? If aught of woe or wonder, cease your search. So, of course, we have that alliteration of the woe or wonder. He speaks to Fortinbras respectfully, hence the you pronouns, but also he makes it clear that what has happened in the Danish court over the course of the last hour is something unprecedented, something terrible. Fortinbras again speaks very briefly. A critic called Seth Tomko has pointed out that Fortinbras rarely says more than 9 lines together at either point at which he appears in the play. And he speaks extremely briskly here. We start with this very short single clause sentence. This quarry cries on havoc. Now, havoc is a military term, and it means the kind of what the victorious army would do when they had won a battle, to pillage, to raid, to sack a town. So, in other words, havoc is a scene of complete destruction. Quarry is a hunting metaphor, as if in a way that the soldiers coming in with Fortinbras are the hounds, but actually what they've come across is havoc. They expected to see the Danish court, and what they've got is this tableau of bodies piled up. Fortinbras then apostrophizes death. So remember, an apostrophe is when a character addresses someone or something that cannot reply to him or her. And in this case, Fortinbras addresses death itself. O proud death, what feast is toward in thine eternal cell that thou so many princes at a shot so bloodily hast struck. Just to be clear here, the metaphor isn't to do with people feasting in the afterlife, kind of, Viking Valhalla style. The metaphor is the idea that death feasts on corpses. And, Fortinbras is incredulous that so many princes, by which he means people of royal blood, so Hamlet, Claudius, Gertrude, of course, women can refer to themselves as princes, the Duchess of Malfi does. And indeed, you've got the nobleman Laertes on the stage as well, also dead. And Fortinbras, in a sense, addresses this rhetorical question to death itself. How is he going to feast on this many bodies? The other outsider, the first ambassador, then concurs. Again, a very short sentence, a very short clause. The sight is dismal. And the first ambassador had come to tell Claudius that his commandment is fulfilled, that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. Obviously, the dramatic irony is rich at this point because the audience knows that it was never Claudius, as Horatio said, who gave commandment for their death. It was, of course, Hamlet, when by kind of sleight of hand he switched the letters, sealing one that he had written with his father's seal and replacing it and sending Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to their fate. Notably, we have ear imagery yet again. The ears are senseless that should give us hearing. And of course, what he means is that Claudius is dead in front of him. The king is dead. But of course, the reference to ears and references to ears pervade the play, recalls Claudius's unnatural murder of his brother very early on. Horatio puts the ambassador to right. Not from his mouth had it the ability of life to thank you. If he'd lived, he would not have thanked you for this news. He did not want Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to die. But jump upon this bloody question. So at this precise moment that we have this bloody affair, you from the Polack Wars, he gestures at Fortinbras, and you from England are here arrived, and he appeals to them to place the bodies out high on a stage in an orderly view. Now, to be clear, a stage means a platform. So, for example, a dais that the thrones would have been on, so that the ruling couple would have had a view of the room. However, this is a play that is permeated with dramatic references, and it's very theatrical. It's very much a play about playing, and it is perhaps fitting, and also possibly another meta-dramatic reference, that ultimately the bodies of the chief actors in the revenge drama, Hamlet, Claudius, Gertrude, Laertes, are placed on the stage. Horatio is appealing to those who have come in to restore order. He also indicates that he is able to tell the truth about what happened. So, thinking a little bit about this moment of the play, Hamlet had chosen to give Fortinbras his dying voice. We saw earlier in Act 4 that his attitude towards Fortinbras was possibly a complex one, possibly slightly nuanced. Hamlet, in his soliloquy, exhibited great admiration for Fortinbras and his military power and his military might, but also reservations that Fortinbras would attack this little piece of ground, this eggshell, and cause the death of so many men for a question of honour. Nonetheless, we also have this idea that perhaps in his dying moments, Hamlet realised that Fortinbras is the ruler that's needed to restore order to a very turbulent and troubled nation. And tragedies often end with, order to disorder, back to order again. That's a very common movement of the tragic form. And you can argue that, in a sense, we go into this world of disorder created by the murder committed by Claudius. And ultimately, in the end, Fortinbras is a restorer of order. In many ways, Fortinbras's words do connect with how Claudius spoke very early on in the play. He takes command. He's, a man of few words. He is very much somebody who is a figure of authority. Okay, going back to the text. Horatio summarizes in many ways what has happened, how these things came about. So shall you hear of carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts. So that triad there in many ways goes back to the language used by the ghost very early on in the play. Carnal most likely refers to what Hamlet always saw as an incestuous relationship between Gertrude and Claudius. Bloody, you can refer to any of the killings as being bloody. Unnatural is the word that the ghost uses about his own murder. So the idea of fratricide, regicide. Um, Accidental judgments, casual slaughters. Accidental judgments could be interpreted as the idea that things that seemed accidental were actually by design. Maybe going back to Hamlet's idea in the first act, scene of the last act, that there is a divinity that shapes our ends. And the idea that, for example, Laertes and Claudius had their plans to kill Hamlet and make it look like an accident, but in the end, purposes mistook, fallen on the inventors' heads. They were the ones who suffered. Casual slaughters, of course, could refer, for example, to Hamlet's killing of Polonius, to give you one example. An interesting question at this point might be, how fully do you think this summarizes the tragedy? Is this a summary of everything that's happened in the play Hamlet? Or is there a dimension to the play that perhaps Horatio not only won't comment on, but can't comment on? Because, of course, even Horatio, Hamlet's confidant, doesn't have access to Hamlet's inner life and inner thoughts. And so much of this play is about the hero's meditations. Okay. Again, Fortinbras speaks very briskly. Let us haste to hear it. We can argue we're going back to ears and hearing again. And call the noblest to the audience. For me, with sorrow, I embrace my fortune. Now, this phrase very much recalls what Claudius was like at the beginning of the play. If you go back to the exposition, if you go back to the very beginning of Act 1, Scene 2, though yet of Hamlet, our dear brother's death, the memory be green, and that it us befitted to bear our hearts in grief, and our whole kingdom to be contracted in one brow of woe, yet so far hath discretion fought with nature, that we with wisest sorrow think on him, together with remembrance of ourselves. Fortinbras speaks much more briefly than King Claudius did at the beginning, but we've still got the same kind of paradox. With sorrow, I embrace my fortune. Fortinbras kind of diplomatically expresses regret about the circumstances, but this is him taking the throne. When he refers to rights of memory, what he is really saying is that he has not forgotten his claim to the Danish throne, which now to claim my vantage doth invite me. He sees his opportunity and he is going to take the throne. And so we note perhaps that although Hamlet gave Fortinbras his dying voice, Fortinbras claims the kingship before he knew that. Horatio, however, does move to legitimise Fortinbras's rule in the eyes of those listening. Of that I shall have also cause to speak, and from his mouth whose voice will draw on more. In other words, he is going to be Hamlet's mouthpiece. He's going to explain to the audience that Hamlet gave Fortinbras his dying voice to be the one to win the election and to be the Dane. Horatio also cautions Fortinbras that they need to act quickly. Lest more mischance on plots and errors happen, they're going to move very swiftly to lay out the bodies and to hear Horatio's story. Now, here, Fortinbras speaks the final lines of the play. Let 4 captains bear Hamlet like a soldier to the stage. And again, yes, it means the dais, it means the position, the platform that's visible in the room. But in a sense here, our protagonist, our central actor, in quite a metadramatic moment, is being symbolically placed, front and centre at the end. And then Fortinbras claims that it was likely if Hamlet had been put on, if he had been given the opportunity to rule, he would have proved most royal. Most texts have it rather than royally. Now, this is an interesting claim. The critic Harold Bloom is very critical of this moment, the idea that Hamlet is like a soldier. And, had he had the opportunity, he would have made a great king. And we must have the soldier's music and the rights of war speaking loudly for him. Harold Bloom criticises the idea that a character who is, if you like, the greatest representation ever of human consciousness is buried as if he's Henry V. Shakespeare's very warlike and martial leader in a much earlier play. And we as the audience who've witnessed Hamlet's soliloquies, his asides, his introspection, his hesitation, his words rather than deeds, might wonder here about the fitness of Fortinbras's epitaph for Hamlet. Have we ever seen Hamlet as a warlike military leader like his father was? Has he been a good potential leader at all, or merely a different kind of leader? Those are questions perhaps for you to decide in your own mind. Yet again, at the very end, Fortinbras points out, take up the bodies. Such a sight of this becomes the field, he means the battlefield, but here shows much amiss. Go, bid the soldiers shoot. Now, you will have realised by now that in Shakespeare's plays, the overwhelming majority of scenes, but not all, end with a rhyming couplet. And for a moment we have that here. Such a sight of this becomes the field, but here shows much amiss. And the rhyming couplet often signifies to the actors that the scene is about to change. It also signals to the audience that we're moving from one phase to another. Things are shifting from one scene. And also, it gives the impression perhaps of order, a bit like a perfect cadence in music. And if you look at many other tragedies, and take, for example, the ending of Macbeth, the ending of Romeo and Juliet, most tragedies do tend to end in the rhyming couplet. But this play doesn't. Go, bid the soldiers shoot. And actually, you can argue that that introduces quite an uneasy note to the end. To be clear, the soldiers are not shooting in a violent way. They're shooting, in a salute as a mark of respect. It is, however, arguably also a show of power as a regime change takes place. And in a sense, the last line of the play is to denote an action of power as well as an action of respect. And critics differ to what extent you can see this as being a positive and a comfortable ending. Okay, just to wrap a few things up. Um, as I've already said, really, it's up to you to think about how you see Fortinbras at the end here. Do you see him as being the restoration of order and decency, or do you see him as a domineering figure? I mean, he's technically quite an important character, you can argue. First of all, in terms of drama and dramatic structure, he's mentioned at the very beginning. He kind of appears at a key middle point, and he's there at the end. That arguably gives the drama shape. In purely practical terms, rather than perhaps, if you like, these dead bodies kind of being there in a freeze frame, and then of course you've got to have them all kind of standing up at the end to take the applause. In a way, the way the bodies are carried out might help a neater and more somber ending to the tragedy at the end there, as Fortinbras gives that order. However, you can also see Fortinbras as being a figure of unease at the end. So the director, Peter Hall, I don't know about you, but I would not particularly like to live in Denmark under Fortinbras. And that's that director's assessment of this character. Kenneth Branagh's film version, which is one of the only ones that actually does use every line of the play and every character, really emphasizes or accentuates the role of Fortinbras. At the very beginning, of course, Fortinbras, he remains an unseen character until Act 4. He actually only shows up on the stage twice. But at the beginning of the film, when Claudius is speaking of him and his potential plans to invade Denmark, he's shown through the film, if you like, through flashback. And therefore, he becomes a kind of a fully fleshed character in our mind, rather than just being the product of words. Now, at the end, Branagh interprets the Fortinbras' final entrance as being a violent one. He shows the Norwegian soldiers under Fortinbras' command converging on Elsinore. Then at the end, just after Hamlet has died, all of the windows and the mirrors in the great hallway are smashed in as the soldiers pour into the room. And at the end, the soldiers shoot their kind of, salute of honour. Hamlet's carried out looking a bit like Jesus with his arms spread out, cross style. But the final phase of the Kenneth Branagh film shows the Norwegian soldiers chipping away and destroying the statue of Hamlet's father, as if they're erasing the old dynasty of, Hamlet's family, and Fortinbras' dynasty is to replace it. So Kenneth Branagh uses Fortinbras throughout and really shows him to be, in a way, quite wolf-like, circling and circling and circling, and then he closes in. Other productions, however, actually omit Fortinbras altogether. To give two very famous examples, but there are others. Laurence Olivier's very early film, 1948, and Mel Gibson's 1990 version. Those films cut the Norwegian subplot out entirely, and the only revenge narratives that take place in their films are that of Hamlet and that of Laertes. I mean, I personally think Fortinbras is a very important character. And for the dramatic structural reasons that I've just alluded to, but also because I think that he feeds into a number of wider issues and concerns in the play. So we've talked a little bit about leadership, kingship, In the world of Shakespeare's Renaissance and the medieval setting in which he imagines Hamlet, to what extent does military might, physical bravery, traditional codes of honour, to what extent are those aspects key to effective leadership? The idea of words versus deeds is an opposition that we see again and again in the drama. And to quote Seth Tomko of On Fortinbras, his actions speak for him. Tomko points out that the two times that Fortinbras appears on the stage, he really says very little, but he does not have to. And the brevity of his speech contrasts with that of Hamlet. And actually, Hamlet in Act 5 has begun to move towards claiming the kingship. You know, it is I, Hamlet the Dane, using his father's seal, referring to him and Claudius as mighty opposites. Horatio praises him, oh, what a king is this. But ultimately, Hamlet never does take the kingship. Fortinbras defeats an army, moves to Elsinore, claims the kingship straight away. He doesn't need to speak much. His power and might is there through what he does. The other reason, however, why many critics would see Fortinbras as being a key character is really to do with the zeitgeist of the time. By zeitgeist, I mean the mood that's prevailing when Hamlet is written. Now, it's very difficult to date the play Hamlet precisely, but most scholars believe now that a likely year for Hamlet to be first performed is 1601. So, unlike Macbeth, for example, we are not looking at a Jacobean play, we are looking at a late Elizabethan play. And by 1601, Queen Elizabeth I is in her 60s, living to a great age for somebody in her era. Her health has begun to fail and she was getting older, and she was, of course, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana. Her cult of personality, in a way, very much depended on her virginity, out of which she took a lot of her power and independence. And of course, perhaps drawing upon the idea that for a woman, honor can come from chastity. She can't, in a sense, have the male honor of riding into battle, but she has an honour of her own. That's the mystique around Elizabeth. Now, of course, her grandfather, Henry VII, came to the throne through civil war, the War of the Roses. Her father, the reason why he had 6 wives in the first place was his quest to have legitimate heirs who could inherit the throne. And Elizabeth has no heir, and she names no heir. Towards the end of her life, almost behind her back, her chief advisor, Robert Cecil, begins to approach James VI of Scotland, who has a good claim to the throne, including that of blood. He's the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin. And he kind of advised and cautioned James VI of Scotland, maybe how he should behave and approach towards the Queen. And ultimately, although Elizabeth never named him as her successor, she always refused to do that publicly. She made it fairly obvious to those around her that she considered that her cousin's son, James, would be a suitable heir. In the end, against all fears, regime change happened quite smoothly. Elizabeth died in the early hours of the 24th of March on 1603. Her government was ready, riders were dispatched to Scotland, James took over very quickly, and there was neither, if you like, the imminent foreign invasion nor the sort of widespread rebellion of people chancing their claim on the throne in the way that had been feared. But in 1601, Shakespeare doesn't know that, and no one knows that, and everyone's beginning to wonder what will happen in the future. And perhaps this idea of another ruler coming in, someone we know very little of, in the same way Fortinbras is largely absent from the play until he comes and takes the kingship. Another power, kingdoms uniting. Maybe, in a way, Shakespeare's exploring possibilities of what might happen with the English throne in a few short years' time. So, overall, though that is the last 50 or so lines of Hamlet, I think the key questions to think about here are perhaps that of what the ending says about leadership, what it maybe says at the end about revenge, and to what extent do you see this as being an ending in which order and is restored? To what extent do you see this as being a positive ending to the play? Those perhaps are the questions most to go away and think about. Thank you very much.